Do you remember those forgotten recipes that stretched a single chicken, a pound of beef, or a bag of noodles into dinner for an entire family? They were the casseroles, soups, and skillet meals tucked into old cookbooks, passed around at church suppers, and served on wood-paneled kitchen tables. These dishes weren't fancy, but they filled bellies, saved budgets, and carried the smell of comfort through every hallway. Let's take a trip back to the 1970s and rediscover 30 recipes that once kept big families fed and happy. American goulash. American goulash was the beating heart of many 1970s kitchens, a dish that managed to be both endlessly humble and endlessly satisfying. It wasn't the slow-simmered, paprika-rich Hungarian classic that inspired its name, but rather a uniquely American creation designed to stretch a few ingredients into a meal that could feed a whole family. At its core, it was ground beef, elbow macaroni, and canned tomato sauce, cheap staples that every pantry seemed to have in bulk. Toss in some diced onion, if you had one rolling around in the crisper, maybe a sprinkle of garlic powder, and dinner was well on its way. The beauty of American goulash was its simplicity. Brown the beef, stir in the tomato sauce, let the pasta absorb all the flavors, and soon you had a pot bubbling with comfort. There was no fuss about timing or presentation, no debates over seasoning levels. If it was hot, hearty, and could be scooped into bowls without falling apart, it was considered a success. Leftovers were inevitable, and in some families, expected, because somehow the flavors only deepened when reheated the next day. For kids, it was the kind of food that filled plates fast and never left anyone hungry. For parents, it was the perfect answer to the nightly challenge of stretching $1 without anyone noticing. Nostalgia has kept this dish alive in memory, even if it rarely shows up at dinner parties anymore. For many, American goulash tastes like home, like weeknights crowded around the table, the television humming faintly in the background, and the smell of tomato and beef filling the air. In today's era of artisanal pasta and gourmet sauces, goulash seems almost quaint, but its legacy remains. It was comfort disguised as thrift, and for that reason, unforgettable. Tuna casserole with potato chips. Few dishes scream 1970s family dinner quite like tuna casserole topped with a crunchy layer of potato chips. It was the kind of meal that didn't need a recipe card or a shopping trip. Everything it required could usually be found in the pantry or fridge. At its core were just a couple of cans of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, some egg noodles, and whatever seasonings or frozen vegetables happened to be around. But the pièce de résistance, the feature that made children perk up at the sight of an otherwise humble casserole, was the scattering of crushed potato chips baked to golden perfection on top. That salty, crispy crown turned an inexpensive meal into something that felt almost indulgent. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets. Noodles were boiled until soft, mixed with tuna and soup in a Pyrex dish, and then topped with a layer of chips that gave a satisfying crunch when the fork broke through. For busy parents, it was a lifesaver, cheap, quick to assemble, and guaranteed to feed everyone at the table with leftovers to spare. For kids, it was a mixed bag. Some dreaded the tuna lurking underneath, while others looked forward to the chip topping as a kind of edible bribe that made the whole dish bearable. Looking back, tuna casserole carries with it a sense of nostalgia that's hard to separate from the wood-paneled kitchens and patterned linoleum floors of its heyday. It was dinner served on TV trays in front of the Brady Bunch, or a dish brought to church potlucks where it disappeared almost as quickly as it was set down. Today, in a world where tuna often means sushi or poke bowls, this casserole feels like a relic, but one that still delivers pure comfort with every bite. Beans and franks. Beans and Franks was the quintessential stretch-a-dollar meal of the 1970s, a dish that could appear on the table in less time than it took the kids to set it. It was simple, hearty, and dependable, the kind of food that asked for no frills and offered no pretensions. All you needed were hot dogs and canned baked beans, two of the most affordable staples of the decade. Slice the Franks into bite-sized pieces, stir them into a saucepan of beans, and let it all simmer together until the flavors melded into that sweet, smoky, salty combination families knew so well. It was survival food dressed up as comfort, filling enough to satisfy a brood of hungry kids without denting the grocery budget. For children, beans and Franks often felt like a treat. Hot dogs had a special magic in those days, turning even the most ordinary meal into something fun. Parents, meanwhile, knew the truth. This dish was a lifesaver. With a couple of packs of Franks and a few cans of beans, dinner could stretch to cover a large table, sometimes with enough left over for the next day's lunch. A slice of Wonder Bread or cornbread on the side made it feel more complete, though no one really complained if it was served straight from the pot. The dish carries with it a certain nostalgia, a reminder of evenings spent gathered around the kitchen table, where the meal mattered less than the company. Today, it has been overshadowed by gourmet sausages and artisanal baked beans, dressed up with craft beer reductions and caramelized onions. Yet the charm of the original remains. Beans and Franks was never about impressing anyone. It was about filling plates, warming bellies, and making do with what you had. In that simplicity lies its staying power. Chipped beef on toast. Chipped beef on toast, affectionately and not so affectionately known as SOS, was one of those dishes that bridged wartime practicality with 1970s family life. Its roots lay in military mess halls, where it was served to soldiers as a cheap, filling way to keep them going. And when veterans came home, many carried the recipe with them. By the time it reached suburban kitchens, chipped beef on toast had become a weeknight standby for families trying to stretch every dollar while still putting something hot and hearty on the table. The dish itself was simple. Thin shreds of dried beef, simmered in a creamy white gravy, ladled generously over toasted slices of bread. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly didn't aim to impress, but it filled stomachs and comforted in its own salty, stick-to-your-ribs way. Making chipped beef on toast was straightforward, which was part of its appeal. Butter, flour, and milk were whisked together into a roux, creating the base of a smooth, rich gravy. The chipped beef, often pulled from a jar or package, was chopped and stirred in until the whole mixture was savory and aromatic. When poured over toast, sometimes even over biscuits or mashed potatoes, it transformed from a bare-bones recipe into a full meal. Parents appreciated its affordability and speed, while kids sometimes eyed it with suspicion, only to discover it was far tastier than it looked. For many families, this dish carried a sense of continuity, a tie between generations who had known both hardship and thrift. It symbolized resilience and resourcefulness, a way of making do that became a tradition all its own. Today, chipped beef on toast is rarely seen outside of diners or retro cookbooks, but for those who grew up with it, the first bite still carries them straight back to kitchens lined with wood paneling and the sound of a percolator bubbling in the background. Sloppy Joes. Sloppy Joes were the glorious, messy staple of the 1970s dinner table, a dish that embodied the carefree spirit of the decade and the practical needs of large families. At their simplest, they were just ground beef simmered in a sweet and tangy tomato sauce, spooned onto hamburger buns that barely managed to hold everything in. They weren't neat, they weren't fancy, and that was exactly the point. A good sloppy Joe was destined to spill onto the plate, drip down your fingers and leave you searching for extra napkins, but no one minded. The fun was in the mess. Preparing them was quick and foolproof, which made them a weeknight hero for busy parents. Brown the beef, stir in a can of manwich or a homemade mixture of ketchup, mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and a little sugar, then let it bubble into a thick, fragrant sauce. Once ladled onto soft buns, it became a meal that stretched a single pound of meat into something filling enough for an entire table of hungry kids. Leftovers reheated beautifully, tucked into lunch boxes or eaten straight from the fridge, which only added to their charm. Culturally, Sloppy Joes thrived because they matched the casual, community-centered vibe of the 1970s. They showed up at potlucks, church dinners, and school cafeterias, bringing with them the promise of simple comfort and shared laughter. Every family seemed to have its own slight twist: extra onions, a splash of hot sauce, or a little more sugar. But the spirit was always the same. Today, in an age of gourmet burgers and carefully crafted sandwiches, Sloppy Joes might seem almost outdated. Yet one bite, messy and sweet, is enough to remind you why they endured. They weren't just a meal. They were a reminder that food could be affordable, chaotic, and deeply comforting all at once. Hamburger Helper. Hamburger Helper was one of the defining convenience foods of the 1970s, a boxed miracle that promised to transform a single pound of ground beef into a full meal for a family. In an era when inflation was tightening wallets and parents were juggling increasingly busy schedules, that cheerful little glove mascot became a symbol of relief. All it took was the box, a skillet, some milk and water, and within half an hour, dinner was on the table. For families with multiple kids and endless appetites, Hamburger Helper wasn't just food, it was a solution. The preparation was intentionally simple. You browned the beef, stirred in the pasta and seasoning packet, added the liquids, and let everything simmer until it thickened into a creamy, savory dish that smelled far more homemade than it actually was. The result wasn't elegant, but it was hearty and comforting, the kind of food that filled plates quickly and satisfied even the pickiest eaters. Children loved it because it tasted indulgent without being complicated, and parents loved it because it meant dinner required almost no thought, no stacks of dirty dishes, and no expensive ingredients. Beyond its practicality, Hamburger Helper captured the cultural mood of the 1970s. It belonged to the same convenience-driven movement that gave us frozen TV dinners, instant pudding, and casseroles bound together by canned soup. Yet it stood out because it felt communal, cooked in one big pan and ladled out in steaming servings around the table. Today, with meal kits and grocery delivery apps promising fresher, trendier solutions, Hamburger Helper seems almost quaint, even kitschy. But for anyone who grew up with it, the memory of that bubbling skillet is oddly comforting. It represents a time when dinner didn't have to be glamorous to be good, it just had to be shared. Shepherd's pie in the 1970s was less about authenticity and more about practicality. The original British dish, made with lamb, had already been reimagined for American kitchens, where ground beef was cheaper, easier to find, and more familiar to the average family. What emerged was a layered comfort food that worked perfectly for feeding a large household on a tight budget. At the bottom went seasoned beef, often stretched with breadcrumbs or oats, then a layer of canned or frozen vegetables, corn, peas, carrots, or whatever happened to be on hand. The crown of the dish was a thick layer of mashed potatoes, usually instant in those days, smoothed or fluffed across the top before baking until golden at the edges. Preparation was straightforward and forgiving, which made it a weeknight favorite. A single skillet of beef and vegetables, a pot of mashed potatoes, And then the quick assembly in a casserole dish created something that felt hearty and complete without requiring complicated steps. For kids, the appeal was obvious: creamy potatoes, savory beef, and vegetables that somehow went down easier when hidden under all that flavor. For parents, it was a reliable way to stretch 1 pound of meat into a dish that could feed the whole family, often with leftovers that tasted even better reheated. Shepherd's pie carried a certain sense of warmth and security to the dinner table. It was the dish you scooped onto plates while listening to the evening news, the food that filled bellies during the energy crisis years, when thrift and resourcefulness were daily necessities. Today, gourmet versions with grass-fed beef or artisan mashed potatoes show up in trendy restaurants, but the 1970s version still lingers in memory. It wasn't elegant, but it was dependable, a layered reminder that comfort often comes from the simplest combinations. Chicken divan. Chicken divan was the casserole that tried to look sophisticated while still staying true to the frugal, practical spirit of 1970s family cooking. Originally created in a New York hotel and named after a fancy dining room, by the time it landed on suburban dinner tables, it had been transformed into something far humbler. The backbone of the dish was cooked chicken, usually left over from a Sunday roast or poached in a hurry, layered over a bed of frozen broccoli. What made it quintessentially 1970s was the sauce, a mixture of cream, of mushroom soup, mayonnaise, and a sprinkle of curry powder or lemon juice if the cook was feeling adventurous. Topped with shredded cheddar cheese and baked until bubbly, it was comfort food disguised as something upscale. Preparation was simple enough that it quickly became a weeknight staple. A bag of frozen broccoli went straight into the casserole dish, chicken pieces were laid on top, the creamy sauce poured generously over everything, and finally a blanket of cheese sealed the deal. Some families even added breadcrumbs for extra crunch. Once baked, it emerged golden and fragrant, ready to be scooped onto plates alongside rice or buttered noodles. It was hearty enough to satisfy, but just different enough to feel like a special dinner compared to plain meat and potatoes. For many families, chicken divan carried the nostalgia of gatherings where everyone crowded around the table, the Pyrex dish steaming in the center. It was often served at potlucks and church suppers too, where its cheesy aroma was impossible to ignore. Today, the dish rarely appears outside of retro cookbooks or nostalgic food blogs, yet its charm remains. Chicken divan was a perfect snapshot of its time. Resourceful, a little quirky, and endlessly comforting in its creamy, cheesy simplicity. Macaroni and cheese bake. Macaroni and cheese bake was the golden child of the 1970s casserole era, a dish that managed to be both thrifty and indulgent at the same time. Boxed mac and cheese, usually Kraft with its unmistakable neon orange powder, served as the base, but the genius of the bake was in stretching and dressing it up so it could feed an entire family. Once prepared on the stovetop, the macaroni was poured into a Pyrex dish, often with a handful of extra shredded cheese, a splash of milk, and maybe even some leftover ham, hot dogs, or canned tuna folded in for protein. The finishing touch was a topping, sometimes breadcrumbs, but more often crushed crackers or cornflakes, that baked into a golden crust. The process was straightforward, and that was the point. Parents could whip it up in less than half an hour, pop it in the oven, and emerge with a bubbling casserole that felt more substantial than a simple pot of mac and cheese. Kids loved it for the creamy pasta hidden beneath that crunchy top layer, while parents appreciated how one inexpensive box could be transformed into a hearty main dish that stretched to cover multiple servings. Leftovers were always welcome, reheating into something just as comforting the next day. The macaroni and cheese bake also had a social side. It was the kind of dish that appeared at potlucks, block parties, and church suppers, its smell filling the air the moment it was set on the table. In an age when food was about practicality as much as pleasure, this casserole managed to straddle both worlds. Today, gourmet mac and cheese recipes call for artisan cheeses and truffle oil, but the baked version from the 1970s still holds its charm. It was humble, hearty, and undeniably beloved. Tamale pie. Tamale pie was one of those 1970s creations that took inspiration from Mexican cooking, but filtered it through the lens of American frugality and convenience. It wasn't authentic tamales by any stretch, but it captured the spirit of stretching inexpensive ingredients into a dish that felt hearty, colorful, and just a little bit exotic for the average suburban kitchen. At its core, tamale pie was a casserole layered with chili-like filling. Ground beef, onions, canned tomatoes, beans, and chili powder, topped with a thick layer of cornbread batter that baked into a golden crust. The result was something between a pot pie and a tamale, though far easier and cheaper than either. Preparation was perfectly in step with the era's love of casseroles. The meat and beans simmered on the stovetop, spiced just enough to keep it interesting without alarming anyone unaccustomed to heat. Once poured into a casserole dish, the cornbread topping, sometimes from a mix like Jiffy, sometimes homemade, was spread over the surface and baked until the kitchen filled with the warm, comforting smell of cornmeal and spices mingling together. Scooped onto plates, each serving delivered the satisfying contrast of saucy filling and fluffy crust. Families loved tamale pie because it was versatile. Vegetables could be sneaked in, beans could stretch the meat further, and leftovers reheated easily for lunches or another dinner. For kids, it felt adventurous compared to plainer fare, while still familiar enough to win approval. For parents, it was the holy grail, inexpensive, filling, and one dish simple. Today, tamale pie feels like a time capsule of mid-century American cooking, a dish born from cultural borrowing and necessity. While modern palates might prefer authentic tamales or spicier chili, the 1970s version still charms with its unpretentious comfort. It was frugal ingenuity, baked under a golden crust. Roast chicken with root veggies. Roast chicken with root vegetables was the Sunday centerpiece of many 1970s households, the kind of meal that made the whole house smell like comfort long before it hit the table. In an era when every dollar had to be stretched, a single chicken was a wise investment. Parents knew how to coax every ounce of flavor from that bird, serving it proudly on Sunday evening, then stretching the leftovers into sandwiches, casseroles, or soup during the week. Surrounding the chicken with hearty vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and onions turned it from a modest bird into a feast that looked and felt abundant, even if the budget said otherwise. Preparation was simple, but felt ceremonial. The chicken was seasoned, sometimes with little more than salt, pepper, and a brush of butter or oil, and then placed in the oven to roast slowly until the skin crisped and turned a beautiful golden brown. Root vegetables, often tossed with drippings from the pan, roasted alongside it, soaking up flavor and becoming tender and caramelized. It was a dish that required little attention once it was in the oven, which left time for parents to wrangle kids or finish chores while the aroma grew richer by the hour. For many families, this was more than dinner. It was tradition. The roast chicken was carved at the table, a ritual that made the meal feel special even in its simplicity. Children might fight over drumsticks while parents carefully divided the breast meat, but everyone left satisfied. Today, when rotisserie chickens can be picked up at any grocery store, the homemade roast might seem old-fashioned, yet its charm lingers, reminding us that one bird and a handful of vegetables could bring a family together in a way few other meals could. It was economy wrapped in elegance. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was a true icon of the 1970s dinner table, a dish that turned the humble act of stretching ground beef into a centerpiece worthy of family tradition. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't refined, but it was reliable, comforting, and endlessly adaptable. At its heart, meatloaf was all about making a little go a long way. A single pound or two of ground beef could be bulked out with breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even oats, bound together with eggs and seasoned with onions, garlic powder, or whatever spices happened to be on hand. The preparation was as unfussy as the ingredients. The mixture was shaped into a loaf, tucked into a pan, and then came the defining touch, a generous slathering of ketchup across the top. As it baked, the ketchup caramelized into a sweet, tangy glaze that gave the meatloaf both its signature flavor and its comforting red sheen. For some families, the glaze was enhanced with a dash of brown sugar or mustard, while others kept it plain. But either way, it was the element that transformed a mound of ground beef into something special. For children, meatloaf was a dish that felt familiar and safe, a dinner that was always served with mashed potatoes or green beans on the side. For parents, it was practical magic, turning inexpensive pantry staples into a meal that filled everyone up with leftovers to spare. The cold slices tucked into sandwiches the next day were almost as beloved as the hot meal itself. Today, meatloaf may sometimes be mocked as outdated, overshadowed by gourmet burgers and trendy comfort food twists. But one bite of that soft, savory loaf with its glossy ketchup glaze proves why it endured. It was food for families, made with love and thrift, baked into tradition. Pot roast with onion soup mix. Pot roast with onion soup mix was one of those quintessential 1970s dinners that made families feel like they were eating high-class comfort food, even though it was really a masterclass in convenience. The secret weapon wasn't hours of careful seasoning or exotic spices. It was a humble packet of Lipton onion soup mix, sitting patiently in the pantry, waiting to work its magic. With that one envelope, a relatively tough cut of beef could be transformed into a fork-tender roast swimming in savory gravy, surrounded by carrots, potatoes, and onions that had soaked up all the flavor during a long, slow cook. It was budget-friendly brilliance, dressed up as Sunday supper. Preparation was almost laughably easy, which only added to its appeal. A chuck roast was nestled into a roasting pan or slow cooker, sprinkled with the soup mix, doused with water or broth, and left to do its thing for hours. By the time the meat was falling apart, the vegetables were silky soft, and the whole house was filled with an aroma that could pull kids away from their television shows or homework. For busy parents, it was practically hands-off cooking, a meal that tasted like effort without requiring much of it. For families, pot roast was more than just food. It was ritual. It was the kind of dish that anchored Sunday evenings, carved at the table while everyone gathered close. Leftovers stretched the value even further, repurposed into sandwiches or stews during the week. Today, with pressure cookers and instant pots promising speed, the slow-baked roast with onion soup mix might seem like a relic. Yet, its nostalgic charm remains undeniable. It was a dish that proved good food didn't need to be complicated. Sometimes it only needed a cheap cut of beef, a packet of seasoning, and time. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Stuffed cabbage rolls were one of those dishes that carried the taste of old-world kitchens into the homes of 1970s America. A recipe born from immigrant traditions, but embraced by families looking for hearty, budget-friendly meals. At their core, these rolls were simple. Tender cabbage leaves wrapped around a filling of ground beef, rice, onions, and seasonings, then baked in a tangy tomato sauce until everything melded into rich, savory perfection. It was the kind of meal that stretched a pound of meat into something that could feed a large family, each roll acting like its own little package of comfort. The process was a labor of love, though home cooks in the 1970s often found ways to simplify it. Cabbage leaves were softened by boiling or steaming, then carefully filled, rolled, and tucked into a casserole dish. The tomato sauce, sometimes made from scratch, more often from canned tomato soup or sauce with a splash of vinegar or sugar, was poured over the top before the whole dish went into the oven. What emerged an hour later was a bubbling tray of rolls that looked as impressive as they tasted, steaming and saucy, ready to be served with bread to soak up every drop. For many families, stuffed cabbage rolls were tied to heritage and memory. Polish, Ukrainian, and other Eastern European immigrants had brought them across the Atlantic, and by the 1970s, they had become staples in potlucks, church suppers, and Sunday dinners. They carried a sense of tradition, of recipes passed down and adapted, yet always rooted in thrift and sustenance. Today, you might find updated versions with quinoa or turkey, but the classic still holds its place. Stuffed cabbage rolls weren't just food, they were symbols of resilience, culture, and the warmth of gathering at the family table. Split pea soup with ham bone. Split pea soup with a ham bone was the definition of thrift turned into comfort, a dish that made perfect sense in the frugal kitchens of the 1970s. Nothing went to waste in households that knew how to stretch every meal, and after a holiday ham or Sunday roast, the bone was never discarded. It was destined to become the backbone of a hearty soup. Split peas, inexpensive and shelf-stable, were the perfect partner. Together, they transformed into a thick, velvety stew that simmered away for hours, filling the house with an aroma that promised warmth and satisfaction long before the first bowl was ladled out. The process was simple but deliberate. The ham bone went into a pot of water, simmering gently until every last trace of flavor had been coaxed into the broth. Dried split peas, along with chopped onions, carrots, celery, and a touch of garlic, were stirred in to cook down until they nearly dissolved, creating that creamy texture without a drop of cream. Bits of leftover ham clinging to the bone found their way into the soup, little treasures of smoky, salty meat hidden in each serving. By the time it was ready, the soup was thick enough to stand a spoon in, the kind of meal that didn't need a side dish beyond maybe a slice of bread or a biscuit. For families, split pea soup carried both economy and comfort. It stretched leftovers into another full meal, often with enough for the next day's lunch. It was food that tasted of resourcefulness, of nothing wasted and everything appreciated. Today, it may not have the glamour of trendier soups, but its nostalgia remains powerful. Split pea with ham bone is still a reminder that the simplest ingredients, given patience and care, can become something unforgettable. Biscuits and gravy. Biscuits and gravy in the 1970s were more than just breakfast. They were a thrifty dinner solution, a way to turn pantry basics into something hearty enough to quiet a table full of hungry kids. The dish had deep Southern roots, but by this era, it had spread across much of America, embraced as a cheap and filling staple. At its core, it was a simple marriage: soft, fluffy biscuits smothered in a thick, creamy sausage gravy. It wasn't fancy and it certainly wasn't elegant, but it was the kind of food that stuck to your ribs and made everyone at the table feel cared for. Preparation was straightforward, which was part of its charm. Biscuits were often made from scratch if there was time, but more often they came from a can, popped open with that satisfying bang before being slid into the oven. The gravy came together in a single skillet, browned sausage, drippings turned into a roux with flour, and milk whisked in until it thickened into a smooth, pepper-flecked sauce. The gravy was ladled generously over split biscuits, soaking into every layer until each bite was a mix of tender bread and savory richness. For parents, biscuits and gravy offered the perfect balance of thrift and comfort. A single roll of sausage could stretch into enough gravy to cover a dozen biscuits, and the ingredients were inexpensive and always on hand. For kids, it was the kind of meal that felt indulgent, even a little fun. Breakfast for dinner was a treat in itself. Today, biscuits and gravy still appear on diner menus and brunch spreads, but in the 1970s, they were a symbol of practicality wrapped in comfort. It was a dish that proved you didn't need extravagance to feel satisfied, just a skillet, some flour, and a little ingenuity. Fried bologna sandwiches. Fried bologna sandwiches were the unsung hero of the 1970s dinner table, a quick fix that turned a humble lunch meat into something surprisingly indulgent. Bologna was cheap, plentiful, and always hanging around in the fridge, stacked in those familiar plastic packages that seemed to last forever. When money was tight and time was short, parents would pull out a skillet, toss in a few slices, and let the magic happen. As the heat hit, the pink rounds of bologna would curl up at the edges, sizzling in their own fat until they were browned and just a little crispy. It wasn't glamorous, but the smell alone was enough to bring kids running to the kitchen. The sandwich itself was simple but satisfying. A slice of fried bologna went onto soft white bread, usually with a smear of mustard or mayo, maybe a slice of American cheese if you wanted to dress it up. Some families added pickles or lettuce, but most kept it bare bones, letting the salty, savory meat do the heavy lifting. The warm, smoky bologna paired with the squish of the bread made for a bite that was both comforting and oddly decadent, especially for a dish that cost only a few cents per serving. For many children, fried bologna sandwiches were a treat, a break from the monotony of peanut butter and jelly or plain cold cuts. For parents, they were a lifesaver, fast to make, and guaranteed to fill bellies without fuss. Today, in an age of artisan charcuterie and carefully crafted deli meats, the fried bologna sandwich feels almost rebellious in its simplicity. Yet for those who grew up with it, one bite is enough to bring back the linoleum floors, the wood-paneled kitchens, and the sense that sometimes the simplest meals are the ones that stay with you forever. Cornbread and milk. Cornbread and milk was one of those meals that blurred the line between dinner and dessert, comfort and necessity. By the 1970s, it had already been around for generations, a dish rooted in Southern kitchens and Depression-era frugality. The concept was simple, almost stark in its practicality. A hunk of cornbread crumbled into a bowl and drowned in cold milk, sometimes sweetened with a little sugar or drizzled with honey, other times left plain and savory. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, which made it a natural fit for families trying to stretch their food budgets without sacrificing warmth or flavor. Preparation couldn't have been easier. Cornbread, often made from a box mix like Jiffy, was baked in a skillet or pan until golden and fragrant. Leftovers from the night before were the usual choice, since day-old cornbread had the perfect texture for soaking. Once in the bowl, the milk softened the bread into a hearty, porridge-like mixture that could be eaten with a spoon. It was the kind of dish that didn't require planning, measuring, or fuss. It simply made use of what was already on hand. For many children of the 1970s, cornbread and milk felt like a treat disguised as supper, something eaten in pajamas while watching evening television. For parents and grandparents, it carried echoes of leaner times, when wasting food was unthinkable and a pan of cornbread could stretch across multiple meals. Some families swore by buttermilk for its tang, while others preferred plain sweet milk, but the effect was the same. Simple ingredients transformed into comfort. Today, the dish is rarely seen outside of nostalgic kitchens or food blogs devoted to heritage recipes. Yet its staying power lies in its humility. Cornbread and milk was proof that even the most modest ingredients could be turned into something deeply satisfying. Pancakes for dinner. Pancakes for dinner was the kind of meal that made kids cheer and parents sigh with relief. In the 1970s, when grocery budgets were tight and energy was often stretched thin, this simple switch-up turned an ordinary evening into something that felt like a treat. Pancakes, after all, were cheap and easy, flour, eggs, milk, and baking powder mixed together on the fly, or even faster, with a box of Bisquick pulled from the pantry. A hot griddle and a ladle were all it took to transform basic ingredients into a stack of golden, fluffy rounds that somehow tasted even better after the sun had gone down. Part of the magic was in the ritual, the batter sizzling as it hit the pan, the flip that everyone watched with anticipation, the stack growing taller as the kitchen filled with that sweet, buttery smell. It was theater and dinner all in one. Toppings were flexible depending on what was around. Maple syrup if you had it, margarine or butter melting down the sides, maybe a spoonful of jam or sprinkle of powdered sugar. Sometimes, in a bid to sneak in protein, strips of bacon or fried eggs were served on the side, but more often than not, pancakes stood alone, unapologetically sweet and simple. For children, pancakes for dinner felt rebellious, as though bedtime rules had been suspended for the night. For parents, it was a lifesaver, a hot meal that could be made in minutes, cost next to nothing, and filled every stomach around the table. In today's world of brunch culture and gourmet stacks topped with fruit compotes and whipped cream, the humble 1970s version might seem plain, but its charm endures. Pancakes for dinner wasn't just about the food, it was about joy, simplicity, and the small rebellion of flipping breakfast onto the dinner table. Leftover fridge omelets. The leftover fridge omelet was the 1970s kitchen's answer to both waste and hunger, a dish that turned odds and ends into something greater than the sum of its parts. At its heart, it was resourcefulness disguised as a hot meal. Eggs, inexpensive and endlessly versatile, became the canvas for whatever scraps needed using up before they spoiled. A half cup of last night's vegetables, a lonely slice of ham, some wilting spinach, even a bit of leftover spaghetti. Everything had a chance of landing inside an omelet. Nothing was too humble or too strange, because once it was folded into fluffy eggs and sprinkled with cheese, it transformed into dinner. Preparation was quick and forgiving, which made it a savior on busy weeknights. A few eggs were whisked with milk or water to give them volume, then poured into a hot skillet. As the eggs began to set, in went the leftovers, chopped small so they blended in, and then, if fortune smiled, a handful of shredded cheddar or American cheese to bind it all together. The final fold, flipping one side over the other, gave the omelet its neat pocket shape, even if sometimes it collapsed into more of a scramble. Either way, it tasted just as good. For parents, leftover fridge omelets were a way to stretch the food budget and keep waste to a minimum. For kids, they were unpredictable but exciting. No two omelets were ever exactly the same, and dinner often came with the question, "Guess what's inside tonight?" In many ways, it was a meal that reflected the spirit of the times. Practical, adaptable, and a little inventive. Today, omelets are more likely to show up on brunch menus with carefully chosen fillings, but the leftover fridge omelet still stands as a reminder that necessity breeds delicious creativity. Chili con carne. Chili con carne in the 1970s was a pot of comfort that could stretch to feed a crowd, a dish that carried a sense of abundance even when budgets were thin. Its roots reached back to the American Southwest, but by this decade, it had become a staple in kitchens across the country, simmering on stovetops from Texas to the Midwest. At its most basic, chili con carne was ground beef browned with onions and garlic, then simmered with canned tomatoes, kidney beans, and chili powder. Some families swore by extra cumin or a dash of hot sauce, while others kept it mild to avoid complaints from picky eaters. But the soul of the dish was always the same: rich, hearty, and deeply satisfying. The preparation was straightforward, which made it a weeknight savior and a Saturday night favorite. The ingredients went into a single pot, bubbling together until the flavors melded into something far more complex than the sum of its parts. Served with cornbread, crackers, or even over rice or spaghetti, chili con carne became more than just a main course. It was a meal that could adapt to whatever you had on hand. Leftovers only grew richer overnight, making it one of those dishes families almost looked forward to reheating. Culturally, chili con carne fit the era's love of hearty communal meals. It showed up at church suppers, football parties, and neighborhood potlucks, steaming away in big pots or slow cookers, inviting people to ladle out bowls and gather together. In a decade marked by inflation and shifting family dynamics, it was a dish that reassured everyone with its warmth. Today, chili has been dressed up with craft beer reductions and artisanal toppings, but the 1970s version remains beloved for its simplicity. It was food meant to bring people together, one steaming bowl at a time. Cabbage soup. Cabbage soup was the very definition of humble comfort in the 1970s, a dish that owed its popularity as much to frugality as to flavor. At a time when every grocery dollar had to stretch and large families needed filling meals on a budget, cabbage became a hero ingredient. Cheap, nutritious, and available year-round, it anchored a pot of soup that could simmer on the stove for hours, feeding everyone with leftovers still waiting for the next day. The basic recipe was as forgiving as it was simple: chopped cabbage, carrots, onions, potatoes, and perhaps a can of tomatoes, all boiled in broth until tender. Meat was optional. Bits of ham, beef, or sausage sometimes found their way in, but the soup was hearty enough to stand on its own. Making cabbage soup wasn't a complicated affair. The vegetables were roughly chopped, tossed into a pot with water or stock, and seasoned with whatever was on hand: salt, pepper, bay leaves, maybe a pinch of paprika if someone was feeling fancy. The soup bubbled gently on the stovetop, filling the house with an aroma that was both earthy and inviting. It was ladled into bowls with a slice of bread on the side, the kind of meal that managed to warm bellies without emptying wallets. For families, cabbage soup carried with it more than just sustenance. It was tied to tradition, particularly for immigrant households who had brought versions of it from Eastern Europe, and it represented resilience in the face of lean times. In the 1970s, it also gained a quirky reputation thanks to fad diets that promised miraculous weight loss by eating nothing but cabbage soup for days on end. Today, it might be overlooked in favor of flashier meals, but its charm endures. Cabbage soup remains a reminder that simplicity, thrift, and heart can still make a deeply comforting dish. Pierogi with onions and sour cream. Pierogi with onions and sour cream were a comforting nod to old-world traditions that found their way into countless American kitchens during the 1970s. Though rooted in Eastern European heritage, by this decade, pierogi had become familiar to families well outside Polish or Ukrainian enclaves, thanks to frozen food aisles that stocked bags of them in neat rows. For many busy households, they were a lifesaver. Affordable, filling, and easy to dress up with just a skillet, an onion, and a dollop of sour cream. They carried with them a sense of heritage cooking while fitting perfectly into the thrifty practicality of the time. The preparation was both simple and satisfying. Frozen pierogi, stuffed with potatoes, cheese, or sometimes sauerkraut, were boiled until tender and then tossed into a pan where onions had been slowly caramelized in butter or margarine. The pierogi browned at the edges, picking up that irresistible flavor from the onions, turning a humble dumpling into something special. Served hot with a generous spoonful of sour cream on the side, the dish was hearty enough to be a full dinner, especially when paired with bread or a small salad. It was the kind of meal that could come together quickly on a weeknight, yet still felt like a nod to tradition. For families, pierogi held both nostalgia and novelty. For those with immigrant roots, they were a continuation of what grandmothers had made by hand. For others, they were a new discovery, a frozen shortcut to something that felt exotic, but quickly became familiar. Children loved the pillowy texture and mild flavors, while parents appreciated how far a single bag could stretch. Today, pierogi are enjoying a renaissance in trendy eateries, but the 1970s version, fried onions, sour cream, and all still lingers as the ultimate comfort food. Jambalaya. Jambalaya in the 1970s was a dish that carried the spirit of New Orleans into kitchens far beyond Louisiana, adapted by home cooks who craved flavor but needed practicality. True to its roots, jambalaya was a one-pot wonder, born from a tradition of making do with whatever ingredients were available. In its most basic form for the decade, it was rice cooked with tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and whatever protein happened to be on hand, usually sausage, sometimes chicken, and on lucky occasions a few shrimp if the budget allowed. It was rustic, filling, and deeply aromatic, with spices like paprika, garlic powder, and cayenne pepper giving it personality without making it intimidating for suburban families. Preparation was straightforward, which was part of its appeal. The sausage or chicken was browned first, releasing fat and flavor. Then vegetables and rice were stirred in along with canned tomatoes and broth. The pot simmered gently until the rice absorbed the liquid and took on the smoky, spicy notes of the meat and seasonings. Unlike many other dishes of the time that relied on boxed mixes or canned soups, jambalaya felt homemade and soulful, even if shortcuts like instant rice or pre-cooked sausage often made their way into 1970s kitchens. The result was a meal that fed many, filled the house with irresistible smells, and delivered both comfort and excitement in every bite. For families, jambalaya carried a touch of adventure. It wasn't as common as casseroles or pot roasts, which made it feel special when it appeared on the table. It echoed regional pride in the South, while spreading across the country as a symbol of hearty, communal dining. Today, jambalaya is celebrated in restaurants and festivals, but its 1970s version remains a reminder that even simple, budget-friendly food can taste like a celebration. Jell-O salad with marshmallows. Jell-O salad with marshmallows was one of the most whimsical and perhaps bewildering staples of 1970s dining. Equal parts dessert and side dish, it often appeared on the table beside meatloaf or casseroles, blurring the lines between sweet and savory in a way only that decade could fully embrace. The base was, of course, a brightly colored box of gelatin, lime green, cherry red, or whatever was on sale, mixed with canned fruit cocktail, pineapple tidbits, or mandarin oranges. Then came the miniature marshmallows, scattered in with abandon, their fluffy sweetness softening as the gelatin set. Sometimes whipped cream or cottage cheese was folded in for good measure, creating a dish that was as much about texture as it was about flavor. Preparation was as easy as opening cans and stirring. Boil the Jell-O, let it cool slightly, then fold in the fruit, marshmallows, and whatever else the cook felt inspired to add. Once chilled, the concoction emerged as a shimmering, pastel-hued centerpiece, often molded into a ring or served in a glass dish that showed off its wobbly charm. At potlucks and church socials, it was guaranteed to catch the eye, its neon glow standing out among the more subdued casseroles and roasts. For kids, Jell-O salad was pure delight, a sweet, jiggly treat masquerading as part of the main meal. For parents, it was a thrifty way to stretch dessert, using inexpensive pantry items to create something that felt abundant and fun. Today, Jell-O salads are often remembered with a mix of fondness and gentle mockery, symbols of a culinary era unafraid of odd combinations. Yet their nostalgia endures. With every wobble and every bite of marshmallow-studded sweetness, they remind us that food is not always about sophistication. Sometimes it's about joy, color, and a little bit of kitschy fun. Rice pudding. Rice pudding in the 1970s was the definition of turning little into plenty, a dessert born out of thrift but remembered for its comfort. It was often made at the end of the week when leftover rice lingered in the fridge, too plain to serve again, but too valuable to waste. Families would transform it with milk, sugar, and a dash of vanilla or cinnamon into something sweet, creamy, and satisfying. Sometimes raisins were added, swelling up as they cooked and offering little bursts of flavor, though children often had strong opinions about whether those raisins belonged there at all. The preparation was simple and unpretentious. Rice was simmered slowly with milk and sugar until it thickened into a custard-like consistency, filling the kitchen with a warm, sweet aroma. Some cooks stirred in a pat of butter for richness, while others topped it with a sprinkle of nutmeg before serving. It could be eaten warm, straight from the pot, or chilled in the refrigerator to become a cool, comforting dessert for later. Either way, it felt like a treat, even though it came from the humblest of ingredients. For parents, rice pudding was a clever way to stretch the food budget and make sure nothing went to waste. For children, it was often remembered as the cozy reward at the end of a long day, spooned out in heaping portions that felt indulgent despite its modest origins. In some families, it carried with it generational ties, echoing recipes passed down from grandparents who had lived through the Depression or the war years. Today, rice pudding might not appear on many dinner tables, overshadowed by flashier desserts, but its charm remains. It was proof that sweetness and comfort didn't require extravagance, just rice, milk, and a little patience. Bread pudding. Bread pudding in the 1970s was the kind of dessert that turned frugality into comfort, a sweet reminder that nothing in the kitchen ever had to go to waste. Stale bread, which might have otherwise been tossed, became the foundation for a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. Cubes or torn pieces of bread were soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, then baked until the custard set and the top turned golden brown. What emerged from the oven was a pudding that managed to be both soft and creamy on the inside while slightly crisp on top, a contrast that made every spoonful satisfying. The preparation was forgiving and flexible, which made it a natural fit for busy households. Any bread would do: white sandwich loaves, dinner rolls, or even biscuits that had gone a little dry. Families often added whatever extras were available: raisins, nuts, or a splash of vanilla for depth of flavor. Some cooks drizzled it with a simple sauce made of butter and sugar, while others served it plain, confident that its warmth and sweetness were enough on their own. It was the kind of dessert that could appear on the table after Sunday dinner or materialize midweek when budgets were tight but comfort was needed. For children, bread pudding felt like a treat disguised as a lesson in thrift, proof that even yesterday's leftovers could become something special. For parents and grandparents, it carried echoes of older times when wasting food was unthinkable and creativity in the kitchen was a necessity. Today, bread pudding has been reinvented with fancy additions like caramel sauces and artisanal breads, but the 1970s version remains timeless. It was simple, economical, and endlessly comforting, the very essence of making do with love. Apple Brown Betty. Apple Brown Betty was one of those desserts that quietly held its place at the 1970s family table. Less flashy than pie, but just as comforting. It was the kind of sweet you could throw together on a weekday night using apples that were starting to soften and breadcrumbs that might have otherwise gone to waste. Unlike an apple crisp with its oat topping or an apple pie with its careful crust, the Brown Betty was humble and straightforward. Layers of sliced apples sprinkled with sugar and cinnamon, alternated with buttery crumbs, baked until the fruit softened and the topping turned golden and crisp. It was simple, honest food, proof that thrift and comfort could happily coexist. The preparation was as forgiving as it was practical. There was no need for rolling pins or pastry skills, just a casserole dish and a willingness to layer what you had. The apples melted into a soft, fragrant filling, their juices soaking into the crumbs beneath, while the top baked into a crunchy crown. Served warm, often with a scoop of vanilla ice cream or a drizzle of cream, it felt like a special treat, even though it required only the most basic pantry staples. Families loved it because it stretched ingredients and delivered a payoff far greater than the effort required. For children, Apple Brown Betty was the sweet ending to a long day, its cinnamon-spiced aroma signaling comfort as it baked. For parents, it was another way to make use of what was on hand while still creating something that felt generous and homemade. Today, in a world filled with elaborate desserts, the Brown Betty might seem old-fashioned, but its charm lingers. It reminds us that warmth, simplicity, and a little creativity can turn leftovers into something unforgettable. Dump cake. Dump cake was the ultimate expression of 1970s convenience cooking, a dessert that proudly wore its lack of fuss as a badge of honor. The name itself told you everything you needed to know. Just dump the ingredients into a pan, slide it into the oven, and wait for magic to happen. No mixing bowls, no careful measurements, and certainly no rolling pins were required. The base was usually a can of fruit pie filling. Cherry, pineapple, or apple were favorites, spread across the bottom of a casserole dish. A boxed cake mix was poured on top, sometimes yellow, sometimes white, followed by a scattering of butter slices that melted down as the cake baked. The result was a bubbling, gooey dessert with a crisp golden crust, equal parts cobbler and cake. The preparation was so simple, it bordered on playful. Families embraced it because anyone could make it, kids included. For mothers juggling busy schedules or trying to feed a crowd at a potluck, dump cake was a godsend. It required little effort but always delivered a dessert that looked and tasted indulgent. A scoop of ice cream or a dollop of whipped cream on top turned it into something worthy of company, even though the effort behind it was laughably minimal. For children, dump cake was memorable not just for its sweetness, but for its novelty. There was something thrilling about watching a few disconnected ingredients transform into a rich, fragrant dessert with almost no work at all. For adults, it was a reminder that shortcuts didn't always mean sacrificing flavor. Today, dump cakes are often mentioned with a wink, a relic of retro cooking that valued ease above everything else. But their charm remains undeniable. In a world obsessed with perfection, dump cake endures as a joyful reminder that sometimes simple is best. That's our trip down memory lane with 30 forgotten recipes that kept families fed and comforted in the 1970s. From casseroles and soups to Jell-O salads and sweet endings, these dishes were about more than food. They were about making do, gathering together, and finding joy in the simple things. If you enjoyed this nostalgic journey, don't forget to give the video a like, share it with friends who love a taste of the past, and subscribe for more stories and recipes from the kitchens of yesterday.